And now we're gonna put it all together by doing this for the Chamber of Secrets scene that I've been talking about this whole video. So if you can pinpoint the source of the change, you can make sure that your scene is actually changing. Hey there, I'm Nicole Wilbur. I'm a writer and story nerd, and welcome back to my channel. I am so excited because today I am talking all about scene construction, specifically 3 major mistakes that I've made when writing my scenes, in the hopes that talking about these sort of mistakes or mishaps might be things that you can identify in your own writing, and I will do my best to explain how I fixed them, so you might get some cool ideas for how you can fix them as well. As I was researching this video, I came across Abby Emmons' video on using scene cards to outline scenes. I'll link it below. It's a great video. And so I thought as I go through this, it would be really fun to build a scene card of our own, step by step, as we walk through this entire video. So at the end, there's like a concrete thing that you can take away and look at. So that scene card that I'm gonna build step by step through the video will be linked below. I will be honest, I've only used it myself for 1 or 2 scenes so far, but I do really like it, and I think it's a good tool just to make everything that we're talking about feel concrete, because I hate those kind of like rambly videos, you know what I mean? Okay, so let's jump right into it. This first one you've heard 100 times before, and please don't turn it off at this point, because I'm gonna do my very best to make it specific and actionable and move beyond the cliche. But the first one, the first major mistake that I have made in a scene, is missing the conflict. So scenes obviously have to have a clear source of conflict. We've heard this 100 times before. This is the thing that I've learned though, that the purpose of the scene, like why it's in the novel, and conflict are different. Every scene in a novel obviously has to have a purpose. Every scene in a novel obviously has to have conflict. Sometimes this advice is very easy to follow, like when your character is fighting the antagonist, charging the castle, fleeing the ship, or arguing with their mother. The conflict is very obvious, and usually it has a big purpose in the overall story. Those are easy. Where I've had trouble is when my scenes have a clear and necessary purpose in the story, but the dramatic element, like the conflict, isn't necessarily clear. Let's talk about an example. In the novel I'm currently writing, I have a bunch of information plots and therefore a bunch of twists. For one of the twists to work, I need my girls to meet a few characters who absolutely can't be in the same room. And so I have one scene where I need to introduce a character and one scene where the other character needs to deliver a critical bit of exposition. So great, I have 2 scenes with a clear purpose, but what the heck is the conflict in a scene described in my outline as character B explains the thing, or girl meets character C? And I think this is where a lot of us can struggle. How do you turn an exposition or purpose-driven scene into one that's truly compelling for readers? Well, I don't know, but I have looked into people who do know, such as J.K. Rowling. I just reread the Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. It's the Valentine's Day scene in the chapter A Very Secret Diary. It's a throwaway scene. It's one that probably a lot of people won't remember. Spoilers upcoming here, but basically this is a scene where in a hallway, Harry is attacked by a Valentine's Day dwarf and his bag spills, is the basic gist of it. So if I was J.K. Rowling and I was writing this book, I would say to myself, I would need some way for Ginny to realize that Harry has her diary. That's the purpose of this scene. Also, Harry needs to learn how the diary actually works. So Ginny has to see that Harry has her diary. How do we do this? Because Ginny thinks the diary is long gone, and she's flushed it down the toilet, she's gone. Harry has no idea who the diary belongs to, and he isn't interested in figuring it out. In fact, as J.K. Rowling, I want to downplay that and keep people from thinking about it too much because I don't want them to guess. There's a lot of problems in doing this purpose-driven scene. If I'd written this, I probably would have had to think and brainstorm for a while. I would eventually get to the fact that the scene needs to be in a public place. Maybe something could happen to make Harry's bag grip and Ginny could see the diary fall out, but there's still no conflict happening. So in the end, what J.K. Rowling did was she had Professor Lockhart bring in a bunch of surly dwarves dressed in gold wings and carrying harps. That's a direct quote, by the way. She had a dwarf decide that he was going to deliver a Valentine to Harry come hell or high water. And it's actually this dwarf who incites the scene. He goes after Harry to deliver the Valentine, and then Harry reacts. I do not want a Valentine to be delivered to me in the middle of the hall. This is embarrassing. The dwarf physically restrains Harry in front of a group of first years, including Ginny, and in the process, it rips his bag open. So then she has Percy enter, and Percy, who wants to keep order. She has Malfoy enter, and Malfoy wants to mess with Harry. She has Ginny enter, and Ginny doesn't want anyone to know the diary belongs to her, and Harry just wants to get out of there and get on with his diary. And suddenly we have so much conflict, 5 sources of opposition all conflicting with each other in a completely hilarious scene. As I was listing all of through that, what was the key that created conflict in the scene? It was what the characters wanted. Someone has to want something, and there has to be opposition in their way in order to create conflict in a scene. It's very, very basic, but it's something that I honestly will forget all the time, and it's a great tool to go back to when you're having trouble figuring out what's happening in a scene. Writing down the motivations of every single character in that scene. What does each character want? Well, want and motivation is different. It's what do they want, that's their desire, and then why do they want it, that's their motivation. And sometimes I don't know what a character would want, especially if they're more of a walk-on character. I have no idea, so I'll sit there, I'll force myself to write down at least 5 possible motivations or 5 possible desires. And then I'll go through them and see where I can create a conflicting want and motivation. What is even cooler is when we go beyond the surface to having the motivations conflicting. So maybe someone doesn't want to give information to the main character because they don't like the main character or they're suspicious of them. Maybe then the conflict isn't I want information, I don't want information, I don't want to give the information, but it's like personal, it's getting down to values. That's what I'm talking about. So when the wants can actually get down to not just an I want this versus you want that, but underneath the surface of my values are conflicting with your values. So that's where I think where the motivation comes in. Sometimes I like to think of wants and motivations as wants being external and motivations being the internal conflict of the motivations conflicting with each other. So you also have, when you do that, you have not only 2 people in conflict, but there's a conflict below the surface of the character's worldview or values. I really hope that makes sense. So let us create our first scene card. This is not the final version. So we have the scene number, we have a scene description, which is just like a sentence of what happens. The next bit, why is this scene in the novel? I think knowing the purpose of the scene for the overall story is super important. I have 4 things listed there. You don't always have to have 4. What characters want is driving the scene is the question, right? So one person, whether that's being enacted by some sort of force. Sometimes I suppose the inciting incident could be an environmental factor like a storm, but I would say the majority of the time there's one character whose desire is driving the scene and creating the inciting incident. And then what comes into conflict with that want? That doesn't necessarily have to be other characters. It could be environmental factors, could be obstacles, could be blah, blah, blah. A lot of times it is other characters. So I started with conflict because it's the most important and basic, but somehow it's one that I still forget. So someone's want must be driving every single scene, or how else do you create conflict? And that's a great question to come back to when you're stuck. All right, so mistake number 2 is not turning. I read somewhere that scenes are change, and I think this is an excellent description. One of the inflection points in my writing life was when I read the story grid and learned that a scene needs to shift. So the story grid denotes a few key things for scenes, and I'm going to go through both of them one by one. So the first one is the 5 commandments. I'm going to explain what these are, but inciting the incident, progressive complication, turning point, crisis, climax, resolution. And the second thing is a value shift. So let's go back to those 5 commandments of storytelling. These are the things that are theoretically in every single scene, as long as you don't get too caught up in them, especially when you're drafting, because you can get really caught up in them and it can kind of blow your mind. But from like a theoretical standpoint, I think it's really helpful. And at the end, I'm going to show you how I kind of incorporate these into my outlining process, so it's not as sort of scientific-y. All right, so an inciting incident obviously is the catalyst. It's where the conflict in our scene begins. Progressive complications are new layers of conflict or obstacles, and these should escalate. So you have like a first small article, and then the next obstacle is bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, you could just keep throwing obstacles at your character. You could keep throwing obstacles in their paths. But if you keep doing that, nothing's really going to happen. You have to have a way to close the scene. That is when the turning point comes in. So the turning point is the final progressive complication. It's the fulcrum of the scene. It's the moment when a big shift happens. The turning point prompts a crisis. It creates a fork in the road. The character can't just continue on their path. They can't just continue getting obstacles thrown at them. They have to choose something. So the turning point is the peak progressive complication. It prompts the crisis. The crisis is a decision point. The character has to decide, should I do this or should I do that? The climax is the result of that decision, and then the resolution is how this will impact the rest of the story, the next thing that you need to propel you forward. And I will have a ton of resources linked below if you want to dive deeper into the story grid, but those are the basic structures, and hopefully they'll make sense. So let's do an example where we talk about these for the Harry Potter scene. So the inciting incident of this scene is the dwarf catches up with Harry Potter. He's yelling, "Oi, you!" and that's our inciting incident. Progressive complications. The dwarf gets physical with Harry. He breaks Harry's bag. Now Harry can't get away. Draco Malfoy arrives. Then Percy arrives. Then the dwarf starts delivering his Valentine's Day song. Your eyes are as green as a fresh pickled toad. Great song. The turning point is when Draco Malfoy spots the diary. So he spots the diary on the ground. He thinks it belongs to Harry. He picks it up and he's ready to tease him, basically, and like read it out loud or whatever. And this is a turning point because it changes the tone of the scene. And even if you read this scene in the book, it says a hush fell over the crowd. There's been a clear shift at this point. And this can be hard to point out, honestly. And in a scene like this, it's very subtle, but it's still there. The crisis, now again, this is really subtle. In some scenes, especially if you're like doing the climax and the hero has a huge moral choice, it's gonna be really obvious and they're gonna like debate and go crazy. But in a lot of scenes, it's as casual as this and it's not explicit. Should Harry break school rules to get the diary back or just let Draco play around with it? That's the crisis. The climax is Harry disarms Draco while Percy threatens consequences. The resolution is Ginny runs into her classroom having seen the diary, and Harry notices the diary is not covered in ink like the rest of his book. I really like this story grid structure because it's neat and tidy and it leads to tight, targeted scenes while also catering to that shift. Now that's the other story grid element I was talking about. The story grid has what they call a value shift. It's the thing that changes, and honestly, sometimes it's ridiculously hard to figure out what it is. It's also super vague, and it can have a lot of meanings, and there can be a lot of different shifts, and different people will probably think the scene shifts in different ways. However, it is a very, very good exercise because a scene has to start somewhere and end somewhere else. So if you can pinpoint the source of the change, you can make sure that your scene is actually changing. Whether or not, as long as someone coming to the scene could identify some sense of change, then you're good. So if you're stuck on figuring out the change, there are a series of questions that the story grid recommends that you use in order to figure those out. Those will also be linked in this PDF thing I'm doing below. So for Chamber of Secrets scene, what are the characters literally doing is the first question. There's a tussle in the hallway between classes. What is the essential action of what the characters are doing in this scene? This basically means that essential action, I think, is just literally like what are the most important things that happen. Harry gets mauled by a Valentine's Day troll. Draco taunts Harry about the secret diary in front of Ginny, and then Harry realizes there's something odd about the diary. So and then the third question is what life value, what sort of state has changed for one or more characters in the scene? So Ginny goes from feeling safe because Riddle's diary is gone to being in danger because she knows Harry has it and Tom can tell him everything that's happened. And Harry goes from being ignorant about the diary to having a clue, to having a clue to how it works. So he goes from kind of like ignorant to interested or ignorant to like, I don't know, all close to understanding, being closer to being understanding. So we have a shift for the audience from ignorant to interested, and for Ginny from safety to danger. Now, if you were to write this down, I might suggest doing the ignorant to interested, because we don't actually know as the audience members at that time that Ginny has that shift. But there you go. Something in the scene changed. Beautiful. Woohoo. Amazing. I think when you're drafting a scene, it isn't necessarily the best to get too in the weeds with the value shift, like what's shifting from here to there. I think that's more of an editing thing, so that is not on the scene card. But let's take a look at it now, and I changed a little bit so as not to overcomplicate things and try to keep it as straightforward and easy to remember as possible. We have everything the same: scene number, scene description, why is the scene in the novel. Then the first question is, what characters want, desire, drives the inciting incident? As you can think of it as character or force creates the inciting incident. How do other characters or forces create escalating conflict? Those are progressive complications. What's the final escalation of the conflict? That's the turning point. What decision leads to the climax of the scene? So what kind of thing is being decided, what kind of actions being taken, what is changing, and then how does the scene resolve? Okay, we're almost there. Thing number 3 that I've made a mistake on is not having magical cookies. So what is a magical cookie? This is a term I got from Susan Dennard's blog. Her blog is amazing. And a magical cookie is basically the thing that makes you super duper excited to write a scene. And she says that, there are some scenes that you're so excited to write, you think of them before you write the novel, and you're like, oh, I can't wait to get to the scene where like the lovers have their first kiss, or where like they're escaping the castle. Like, I'm so excited for that. Or I know there's going to be a great bit of humor in scene 35. Like, I can't wait to write scene 35. And her point is that every single scene should be a magical cookie scene. There should be something that you can love and be excited about in every single scene. Because if you're not excited about it, readers won't be excited about it. So again, there's a lot of scenes where I know what my magical cookies are. But this comes up a lot when there's like a logistic aspect to the story. Like, I have to get my point characters from point A to point B, so I'll just write about them going from point A to point B. No, you don't want to do that. You want there to be something interesting in it for you. So if I can't immediately identify the magical cookie in a scene, I will sit down, brainstorm, re-outline, and rework the plan for the scene until there's something I can't wait to write. Whether that is inserting romantic tension, giving my characters a secret mission, creating an opportunity for banter, introducing humor, or honestly even like completely reworking what the structure and purpose of the scene is going to be. In our example, the magical cookie is definitely the Valentine's Day dwarf. It literally has no impact anywhere else in the story, but it makes things delightful and hilarious. It's a fun scene to read because it's funny. Another magical cookie could be Percy Weasley being like very Percy and everyone out of the corridors, or Malfoy showing up and being awful. Anything that makes it fun and interesting and gripping for you. So now our scene card looks like this. We have one change, which is the magical cookie. And now we're going to put it all together by doing this for the Chamber of Secrets scene that I've been talking about this whole video. So scene number, I don't know, I'm too lazy to count. It's in the Very Secret Diary chapter in like the middle. Why is this scene in the novel? Number 1, Ginny needs to see that Harry has the diary. And number 2, Harry needs to figure out how the diary works. It absorbs the ink. The magical cookie is the Valentine's Day dwarf is trying to deliver Harry a ridiculous Valentine and he is not having it. It's very funny. So what characters want, drives, or desire drives or creates the inciting incident of the scene. That is the dwarf's desire to deliver the Valentine to Harry. That is our inciting incident. His desire to deliver the Valentine creates that inciting incident. How do other characters or forces create escalating conflict, progressive complications? Harry tries to get away from the dwarf, but he can't. Draco, Percy, and Ginny are all watching and all arrive to ask what's going on, and this makes him, feel more self-conscious and worried about this dwarf giving this stupid Valentine. Percy is angry at them for being in the halls. The dwarf delivers the Valentine. Draco makes fun of Harry. What's the final escalation of that conflict is the turning point. Draco grabs the diary and he taunts Harry. What decision leads to the climax of the scene? Harry decides to disarm Draco, getting the diary back. And how does the scene resolve? Harry realizes the diary isn't covered in ink, it absorbed the ink, and he resolves to examine the diary further. And there we have it. So all of this is available on my website. Definitely, if you're interested, subscribe to the newsletter on my website, subscribe to the channel if you're also interested in that. The newsletter will be going out at some point. I will be sending one out. I know I just haven't gotten around to it quite yet with starting a new job, but it is coming and I am so excited for all the goodies that will be in there. If you like this video, please give it a huge thumbs up. That really helps me out a lot. The next video I'm putting out is going to be a series of examples. I think I'm going to examine maybe like 5 scenes and try to do this kind of card thing for every single one of them and do a little bit of an analysis for all of them. So if that sounds cool to you, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. Thank you again so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it, and see you next time.